The election campaign has certainly had plenty of spending, lots of campaign goodies to buy your votes with your money. But where's the serious debate about reform, Australia's industry engine room, the way we educate our young Australians, our energy future? At the moment, it's a choice between two unpopular leaders fought in very negative terms, when I think we deserve a fair dinkum debate about policy. It's never been a more important time for our country. Someone who does have a serious policy brain and has done the job of developing policy in both opposition and government is my next guest. Former Chief Economist to Prime Minister Abbott, a former Reserve Bank and Treasury official, now Senior Fellow at the RBA, Dr. Andrew Stone, joins me now. Andrew, I made the point about there not being enough policy detail or indeed reform in this election campaign, lots of spending. I want to go to the particular policy announced by Labor yesterday. They claim this is sort of a big winner, a 40% stake for taxpayers in a whole lot of homes for first home buyers. What's your view of this?
Good evening, Peter. I think your summary that it's in keeping with an election in which there are lots of targeted announcements that don't represent really serious policy applies perfectly here. This is really tinkering at the edges. It's not actually a housing policy so much as a policy targeted at providing, at assisting people to obtain certain social housing for particular selected groups. So in particular, if it only is available to 10,000 households, it's worth remembering that Australia has 10 million households. So if it's 10,000 households a year, it's going to be a very select group of people who benefit from this. And as you say, then the idea is that the government will effectively reduce the cost that they have to pay to 60% if it's a new home or 70% of the normal purchase price if it's an existing home. That will help some people, some of those selected favoured groups, a few people to get houses, but it's not fundamentally going to address the real problem with housing, which is that we've had astronomical housing inflation. That's what we need policies to address, and all of these other sorts of policies, including, I may say, the government's approach here of trying to reduce the upfront deposit that people require. That again is really tinkering at the edges, not properly addressing the two fundamental issues, which are where interest rates are and the level of demand, which is heavily affected by immigration.
Right, well, talk to me about interest rates, because there's a lot of conjecture tomorrow that we'll see an increase. We had the RBA governor, Reserve Bank governor, say there would be no increase to the official cash rate before 2024. We obviously had that big 5.1 number come out last week in terms of the inflation that's scared the bejesus out of everybody, and I think quite rightly. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow, and where will it go from here?
Well, it's always hard to say. My guess is the Reserve Bank will raise interest rates, though that in itself is a huge indictment of the bank in a short-term and a long-term sense. It means if they do, they will, as you point out, have broken a promise that they made, that they were going to keep rates effectively at zero right through until 2024. When they made that promise, that was, in my view, an absurd thing to do. And indeed, where they've held policy rates for the last 18 months have also been quite inappropriate to the state of the economy, notwithstanding the pandemic. The upshot, however, is they find themselves in this extremely awkward position now that inflation is taken off, exceeding 5% here. It's much higher again, actually, in other major overseas economies, over 8 in the United States, over 7 all across Europe. So there are these tremendous inflationary pressures, and the Reserve Bank's hand may well be forced. And yet that is also at a disastrous time, because they allowed the housing market to go absolutely bonkers. Nearly 30% price rises in Sydney last calendar year, and now they might be raising interest rates at a time when the housing market is already cooling, and when people who have bought into that market may suddenly find themselves terribly exposed to even a small increase in interest rates.
Why do you think we've thrown the towel in on debt? Why do you think that the Liberal Party will keep the cap on spending? Labor says they'll abolish it. They put out their finance plan last week. You could drive a truck through it. We've got $1 trillion debt, and it's not a feature of this campaign.
It is extraordinary. Again, it goes to the point you made at the beginning about a campaign that is focused on trivia and targeted announcements to target very select groups whom the government and the opposition think will be critical to securing key electorates. But it's extraordinary that we don't have more focus. That said, on the $1 trillion of debt and the incredible deficits that we've been running, That said, again, part of the blame for this, a significant part, falls to the Reserve Bank. Because what is one of the reasons why governments in the past haven't been able to just carry on whenever they ran big deficits and ignore them? It's because as soon as you start running up debt, you would start to encounter a serious interest bill. And people get cranky about the idea that billions and billions of dollars of their taxes are just being spent in interest. The thing that has been different this time is that even as we ran up at the Commonwealth level an extra $300 billion of debt, interest rates at effectively zero for the cash rate and extremely low as a result for longer-term bond rates have meant that it's hardly made much difference in the near term to the cost of servicing that debt. The trouble is, I think we're about to discover that now that inflation's taking off, the interest rates will rise and suddenly we'll have a big debt servicing cost. So I suspect in 3 years' time, whenever the next election is, it might be a much bigger issue. But again, we should have been dealing with it now or in fact in the last few years.
Sage words as always. Dr. Andrew Stone, thank you for your time.